It was a cloudy Thursday morning at Westwood Middle School, and the 8th grade English class was buzzing with activity. Students shuffled in, chatting about everything except the lesson that awaited them. Sitting quietly in the second-to-last row was Elijah Carter, a 13-year-old black boy with a passion for words. Elijah loved writing poems in his notebook, often scribbling down verses during breaks. His words flowed naturally, capturing the world as he saw it. But in class, he rarely spoke. That day, the teacher, Ms. Trenton, was reviewing a grammar exercise. A stern woman in her 40s, she was known for her rigid teaching style and her tendency to call out students who made mistakes. "Elijah," Ms. Trenton called, scanning the room with her sharp eyes. "Would you read the sentence you've written?" Elijah hesitated, gripping his pencil tightly. He looked down at his notebook, feeling the weight of the class's gaze on him. Slowly he read aloud, "The bird flew high like it was trying to reach the sun." A few students giggled at his choice of words, and Ms. Trenton's lips curled into a condescending smile. "Elijah," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "It's trying, not tryin'. If you're going to participate in my class, at least try to speak properly." The giggles grew louder, and Elijah's face burned with embarrassment. "Language is a tool," Ms. Trenton continued, her voice loud enough for the whole class to hear. "And if you can't use it correctly, no one's going to take you seriously." Elijah clenched his fists under the desk, his heart pounding. He wanted to explain that tryin' was intentional, that it added rhythm and authenticity to his sentence. But the words caught in his throat, weighed down by the laughter around him. After class, Elijah sat alone in the cafeteria, scribbling furiously in his notebook. The sting of Ms. Trenton's words still lingered, but he poured his frustration into his writing. "You'll see," he muttered under his breath, his pencil flying across the page. "One day, you'll see." What Ms. Trenton didn't know was that Elijah's poetry had already begun making waves in the local community. And in just a few days, her assumptions about him would be turned upside down. 2 days later, Westwood Middle School buzzed with excitement as students and teachers prepared for the weekend. Elijah sat quietly in the back of the classroom, his notebook open as usual. His mind wandered to the weekend ahead, where something extraordinary awaited him. Elijah's poem, Wings of Resilience, had recently been selected for a prestigious youth poetry competition. His heartfelt verses about overcoming challenges had resonated deeply with the judges, and he had been invited to perform live at a local event that would be broadcast on the city's most-watched news channel. The competition had been Elijah's outlet, an escape from the judgment and ridicule he often faced. His mother had encouraged him to submit his work, always reminding him, "Your words are powerful, Elijah. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." On Saturday morning, Elijah stood backstage at the event, clutching his notebook. He peeked out at the audience, a mix of families, teachers, and local leaders. Bright lights illuminated the stage, and cameras captured every moment for the broadcast. When Elijah's name was called, the crowd erupted into applause. He walked to the microphone, his heart racing but his determination steady. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear but filled with emotion. "This poem is called Wings of Resilience. It's about finding strength in yourself, even when the world tries to bring you down." As Elijah read his poem, the audience fell silent, captivated by his words. "They laughed at my speech, at the way I would talk, but they couldn't see the rhythm in my walk. Grammar they mocked, but my voice still sings, for I've learned to soar with broken wings." His verses flowed effortlessly, weaving imagery and emotion into a tapestry that touched everyone in the room. By the time he finished, the crowd gave him a standing ovation. Meanwhile, at home, Ms. Trenton sat on her couch with a cup of coffee, flipping through channels. She paused when she saw the live broadcast of the poetry event. The sight of Elijah at the microphone made her freeze. "What is this?" she muttered, leaning closer to the screen. As Elijah performed his poem, Ms. Trenton's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. The boy she had mocked just days earlier was now being celebrated as a poetic prodigy. When the host introduced Elijah as one of the youngest poets ever to receive national recognition, Miss Trenton's embarrassment deepened. She realized she had grossly underestimated him, and that her words had been not just dismissive but entirely wrong. As the broadcast ended, Miss Trenton sat in silence, her coffee forgotten. For the first time in years, she felt truly humbled. Monday morning arrived, and the usual hum of conversation filled the halls of Westwood Middle School. But this time, something was different. Whispers about Elijah's televised performance had spread like wildfire, with students and teachers alike buzzing with excitement. "Elijah was on TV," a girl exclaimed to her friend near the lockers. "Did you hear his poem? It was amazing." "Yeah, my mom said he's like a genius or something," her friend replied. Elijah walked through the hallways quietly, his notebook tucked under his arm. He noticed the stares and heard the whispers, but he didn't say much. While part of him felt proud, he didn't want the attention to change who he was. As he entered the classroom, the energy shifted. Students who had ignored or teased him before now greeted him with smiles and congratulations. Even Chris, one of the more outspoken boys in the class, gave him a fist bump. "Hey man, that poem was fire," Chris said. "You're legit." Elijah nodded with a small smile. "Thanks." When Miss Trenton entered the room, the buzz of conversation died down. Her usual stern demeanor seemed softer, almost unsure. She cleared her throat and looked directly at Elijah, her expression unreadable. "Elijah," she began, pausing as the class turned to look at him. "I saw your performance this weekend. It was impressive." Elijah met her gaze, his face neutral. "Thank you, Ms. Trenton." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Miss Trenton glanced around at the expectant faces of the students before addressing the class. "Let's talk about poetry today," she said, her voice slightly strained. "It seems we have an expert among us." The class erupted into laughter and cheers, and Elijah felt a mix of pride and discomfort. "Perhaps Elijah would like to share one of his poems with us," Miss Trenton suggested, her tone more hesitant than usual. Elijah hesitated, glancing at the eager faces of his classmates. Slowly, he nodded and stood up, his notebook in hand. "This one's called The Sound of My Words," he said, his voice steady. As he read, the classroom grew silent. His words painted vivid pictures of struggle, resilience, and triumph, and by the time he finished, the room burst into applause. Ms. Trenton clapped along with the students, her expression a mix of pride and regret. "Elijah," she said softly, "thank you for sharing. Your talent is remarkable." Elijah nodded again, but inside, he knew her compliment wasn't enough to erase the sting of her earlier insult. Still, he decided to let his words speak louder than her past judgment. The excitement from Elijah's performance didn't fade. Throughout the week, students and even other teachers approached him to share their admiration for his poetry. For Elijah, it was surreal. He had always loved writing, but now it felt like the world was finally seeing him for who he truly was. In contrast, Miss Trenton seemed quieter than usual. During lessons, her typically sharp tone had softened, and she avoided making eye contact with Elijah. It was clear that his televised performance and her role in dismissing him earlier was weighing on her. On Friday afternoon, just before the bell signaled the end of the school day, Miss Trenton asked Elijah to stay behind. The classroom emptied, leaving the two of them alone in an awkward silence. "Elijah," she began, folding her hands on her desk, "I want to apologize." Elijah blinked, surprised. "For what?" "For how I treated you last week," she said, her voice genuine. "I was wrong to mock your grammar. I didn't understand that your word choices were intentional, and I certainly didn't see the bigger picture of your talent." Elijah nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue. "I think I let my assumptions get the better of me," she admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. "And I realize now that my words were not only dismissive but also hurtful. I'm truly sorry." Elijah looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "Thank you for saying that, Ms. Trenton," he said. "But it's not just about me. You're a teacher, and your words matter. When you say something in class, it can lift someone up or tear them down. Ms. Trenton nodded, her face full of regret. You're absolutely right, and I'll do better. You've taught me an important lesson, Elijah. He offered her a small smile. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do next. The next week, Ms. Trenton made noticeable changes in her teaching style. She encouraged students to share their creative work without fear of judgment and emphasized the importance of voice and authenticity in writing. During one lesson, she brought in a printed copy of one of Elijah's poems and asked the class to analyze it. Elijah, she said, would you like to explain your thought process behind this piece? Elijah hesitated but then stood up, sharing his insights with the class. His confidence grew with every word, and by the end, his classmates were applauding again. For Ms. Trenton, watching Elijah thrive was humbling. She had underestimated him, but now she saw his brilliance, and she was determined to nurture the talents of all her students, no matter their background. The transformation in Ms. Trenton's classroom was undeniable. What had once been a rigid environment dominated by grammar drills and strict rules had become a space where creativity flourished. Students who had previously been too shy to speak began sharing their work, inspired by Elijah's bravery and talent. Elijah's presence became a cornerstone of the class. Ms. Trenton often referenced his poems during lessons, using them as examples of how words could be powerful tools for expression. One afternoon, the principal of Westwood Middle School, Mrs. Blake, stopped by to observe the class. She had heard about Elijah's televised performance and the changes in Ms. Trenton's teaching style. As the class discussed one of Elijah's poems, Mrs. Blake smiled, impressed by the lively and respectful exchange of ideas. After class, she pulled Ms. Trenton aside. I can see a real difference in your classroom, Mrs. Blake said. The students seem more engaged than ever. What changed? Ms. Trenton hesitated, then said, Elijah changed things. His talent reminded me that teaching isn't just about rules and structure. It's about nurturing creativity and encouraging students to find their voice. Mrs. Blake nodded. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. This is the kind of environment that helps students thrive. Outside of school, Elijah's poetry continued to gain recognition. He was invited to perform at local events and even received offers to publish his work. Despite the growing attention, he remained humble, focusing on honing his craft. One day, Elijah received a surprise visitor at his desk. Ms. Trenton approached him with a copy of the school's literary magazine, freshly printed. I wanted you to have the first copy, she said, handing it to him. Elijah flipped through the pages and stopped when he saw one of his poems featured prominently on the first page. Below the title was a note written by Ms. Trenton. This poem reminds us of the power of words to inspire and heal. Thank you, Elijah, for sharing your voice with us. Elijah looked up at her, his expression softening. Thank you, Ms. Trenton. No, she said with a small smile. Thank you. You've taught me as much as I've taught you, maybe even more. As the school year progressed, the impact of Elijah's work extended far beyond the classroom. His story inspired students and teachers alike, proving that talent knows no boundaries and that assumptions can be shattered with a single voice. For Elijah, the journey wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about staying true to himself and letting his words speak for him. And for Ms. Trenton, the experience served as a humbling reminder. Greatness often lies where we least expect it.